So hello, this is Jeff Ausloos speaking with my colleagues Theo and Daniel. And we'll have a session now on a blueprint for digital trace data collection through data donation. I'm the designated lawyer in this presentation, so I'll first be giving you a brief legal background on this topic. So first of all, I'd like to briefly start with highlighting some of the key issues that we can all observe in digital research. And obviously, there's many issues and challenges we face, but there's three that I'd like to mention for our purposes here, which is complexification, concentration, and privatization. So first of all, we're confronted with increasingly complex data ecosystems with wide-ranging effects in all corners of society. A growing number of devices and services being connected, growing number of human experiences and societal processes that are being datafied in many different ways, especially during these Corona days. And so we can also observe the concentration or centralization of data in the hands of just a few big players due to a variety of economic and technical reasons. And so we see these platforms or a handful of technology companies positioning themselves at critical junctions in this information ecosystem as sort of the infrastructure that modern society runs on. Which brings me to the third point, privatization, because as I already alluded to, these choke points, these central points are generally private or corporate actors. And so the bulk of data that is collected or generated today is sealed off, and essentially the research potential, the research agenda, even if you will, of that data is determined by these respective private actors. And so there's many, over the years, there's many ways in which researchers have tried to overcome these challenges. I don't want to spend too much time on this slide, just to give you an overview of the types of ways that researchers have tried to overcome these challenges. And so first of all, perhaps in the most through amicable relationships or with respective companies, and social science one would be the most straightforward example there. There's many issues there because it might further solidify power dynamics in the private sector, but also in academia, and it might also affect academic independence, for example. And so the three latter ones are more adversarial ways that researchers have gone about getting their hands on data. So secondly, we have repurposing existing tools, especially after Cambridge Analytica. This is increasingly hard to do. Researchers have come up with more independent tools, browser plugins or apps to collect data. There's benefits to this as well, but they also raise a lot of ethical and legal issues. And then fourthly, there's also some research that relies on sort of legal obligations of transparency. And so there's an increasing number of legal obligations on corporations to publish certain information in consumer protection law, but also think of environmental protection, food safety, a whole bunch of these frameworks exist. And so what I'd like to suggest is to add another sort of tool that can be potentially very valuable to this toolbox for researchers, which is Article 15 in the GDPR. Even though I guess that most of people listening to this panel will have heard of the GDPR already, I thought, because probably most of you are not lawyers, I'll give a very brief primer on the GDPR, which entered into force in 2018, which replaced an existing framework that had been in place since 1995, which essentially puts in place this framework to put in place checks and balances to ensure a fair data ecosystem. And because data is everywhere these days, it's being processed everywhere, it has very far-reaching consequences. So this is new framework. And so in order to install these checks and balances, the GDPR puts in place a number of constraints and safeguards. You might have heard of the purpose limitation principle, so you can only process data for designated purposes, data protection by design, et cetera, et cetera. And so an important component in this whole framework is our data subject rights, a right to erasure, right to data portability, right to object, and indeed the right of access. These are explicitly put into the GDPR as sort of tools offered to individuals or data subjects in the GDPR lingo to manage what happens with their own information. And so the right of access gives you the ability to learn more about what is done with your data. And it's very important to know that this right does not just give access to the actual data that a company holds on you, but also a lot of additional metadata, if you will. And so what purposes is it used for? How long is it stored for? Who is it shared with, and where does it come from? How is it enriched with other data, and so on? And obviously, I don't need to tell you that all of these data points can be quite valuable input for researchers. So, an additional thing that the GDPR introduced is sort of the modalities for making these rights more effective. And so, importantly, from now on, these rights also need to be accommodated electronically. So when you file an access request, when you ask for your data, this needs to be given in an in a commonly used electronic format. So I'll run through this very quickly. There's many benefits, but also some challenges raised by using this access rights as a methodological tool. I think many of these are pretty straightforward. It gives you a legally enforceable way to get your hands on data, which is a huge benefit when compared to these others, to these other methods that I mentioned before. It comes built in with a lot of legal safeguards, so that's what I refer to with democratically designed. A lot of the other research methods that have been used so far can raise some ethical concerns. This might be less of an issue here. There's also a couple of risks, of course. There's been some research into the fact that this requirement now puts a lot of puts an obligation on the shoulders of these companies to put in place this infrastructure to facilitate these rights, and of course this raises issues as to leaks or might facilitate breaches and hacking. I don't know, I think I'm already over time, so perhaps we should jump to the next slide. Theo.
Yeah, and so I am the designated communication scientist in the room. So just to kind of to speak a little bit towards the potential that we see for communication research. So as there has been a lot of discussion already, or increasing discussion in the computation, especially in the computational methods and the computational communication science type of groups, about partnering with users to collect this type of data. So that has the potential to, instead of using an API or instead of trying to scrape something, you're actually getting information coming directly from users who are filing these data access requests. And there's a potential for transparent and also participatory research, because you are also including the users that are subject to this type of processes. They're actually donating their data to our research, and also allows the access to individual data behind the walled gardens from these platforms. So it's an alternative to APIs, not necessarily that it's simply replacing an API, but it's actually giving a lot of other different type of data that would not otherwise be available, even because of all the privacy concerns and of what you should or could normally get out of an API, should the platform allow you to do. So as a research method, it brings some advantages or some potential there, and also as a measurement opportunity, because we are talking about here about potentially getting access to time-intensive data and events and dynamics for one individual or for a set of individuals. So you're not only looking at, for example, at one post or a couple of things that might be coming through scraping or APIs, but you get a view for that individual about time-stamped data and events that might be happening in that platform. It's also a passive behavioral measurement, so we're using digital trace data to potentially go beyond what we would normally be able to get through self-reports, and we're talking about social desirability might be a lower concern here, but also we're talking about we're overcoming some of the issues that we have about memory effects and availability of behavioral data of unnoticed behavior, but also because we have the individuals also here, right? So we are asking the individuals to donate their data. We have a unique opportunity to also link with self-reported data, in the sense that there are several things that we would normally actually do with self-reports anyway, and we can combine it with digital trace data. So it opens up a lot of opportunities for us. but also brings in a lot of challenges with it, or things that we need to consider carefully, because it's not just about getting somebody to donate an XML file or a CSV that they might download from a platform, but we need to be careful about the participants' privacy, because we're getting access to extremely personal and information that is extremely identifiable in that sense. We then become very critical actors within the even in the GDPR perspective, because we will be responsible for the processing of individual data that individuals are downloading from platforms. So we also need to see how we should minimize actually the data that we are collecting to only the things that are really necessary. How do we handle the consent not only of the individual that is downloading their data, but potentially the information from other individuals that might come in with that data package? And also more general discussions about how representative it is, the type of data that we're getting, and the validity of the measurements that we have. And with that, I think we open quite a lot of methodological discussions that Daniel can help provide a first answer to.
Thanks, Theo. So I'm the designated methodologist on this presentation, and thanks for having me in your party. At Utrecht, we're working on an actual implementation of these ideas. And so I'd like to give you a brief overview of the blueprint that we've been working on, the system we've been designing together with, in collaboration with Center Data in the Netherlands and GASIS in Germany, and also the University of Amsterdam. So what have we been doing at Utrecht? Well, at the top right, you see these different platforms that generate data, and that a random sample, for example, of participants that you can see to the bottom left, might ask access to. So the first step would be that randomly selected participants in standard samples could request their data download package. And then subsequently, from those data download packages, we can see at the participant's device a lot of different data, so high dimensional measures. We're not going to necessarily look at all of this data at the same time yet, but what we're going to do is we're going to design a system that we called Miffy, named after a well-known rabbit who likes to juggle different books and calculate scores based on validated variables. So we're going to not take the entire data donation package with all your secret conversations and holiday pictures, but instead we're going to deduce that information that will be useful for the researcher. And the system will ask the participant if it's okay to send these specific scores to the researcher. And if the participant then gives the informed consent to send only the scores deduced from the packages to the researcher, only then will that data be sent along to the researcher. Now, you can learn or train or estimate the models that we need for this system to work in a distributed way, which means that we don't actually need to collect all of the data donation packages in one place, but we can send the model along to each of the separate packages, so to each person's device, and that way the data donation approach allows for two separate things which previously had been a trade-off against each other. Namely, on the one hand, you have a wealth of available data in these data download packages. There's location data, there's pictures, there's conversations, text, and also structured data. But on the other hand, you can actually protect the privacy of each individual person, and the people give consent on the use of their data for the specific purpose that the research is for. So no sensitive information is transferred to the researcher, and respondents do actually retain control over their own data. That's the advantage. There's also a lot of different kinks to work out still, so we're still very much in development, and we like hearing from you to learn what you're doing and how we can make things better. Overall, we think that this approach is very promising, and we'd like to keep working on it in the future. Thanks.